Greetings, friends. This is an introduction to the book of Acts that exists as part of an undergraduate course that I teach on the book of Acts. And I wanted to make it available to any of you who want to study, those of you in local churches who might want to use this for Bible studies and whatnot. As we come to the book of Acts, we want to begin by asking some major questions. One of the questions we ask, or several of the questions we ask, are who wrote this book? Sometimes knowing who wrote the book can help you understand what the purpose is and what that author is trying to do. So I introduce myself in this video early, and I tell you who I am and what I'm trying to do and what the context is. And so you know a little bit about this. This is not a graduate course. I'm not going to do a deep dive into all the super technical details that you might get into in a graduate course. This is an undergraduate course, and knowing that that's primarily what I do and what I do here in my work, you'll understand that. What do we know about the author? Why did the author write this book? Knowing some of the background details about an author maybe will help us understand the purpose of writing the book. As we read the book of Acts, what themes should we be looking for? Sometimes when we read the book, we tend to notice themes that begin to emerge. Sometimes it's helpful to have a guide who walks through the book of Acts with you and says, hey, notice this, notice this. Have you seen this? Can you start to put that all together? That's one of the things that we want to begin doing here. And then at the end of this video, I want to ask this question. What is the contribution of the book of Acts to modern faith? The book of Acts is a book of ancient historiography, plain and simple. I mean, it's doing other things, but very simply, it's an ancient historiography. It tells us about people who lived back then. They went here, there, and yonder, and they did this, that, and the other. What does any of that got to do with us? And so we'll ask those questions as we get toward the end. Well, let's dive right into it. The questions. Okay, here is a first century Polaroid of Luke. I uncovered this. No, I really didn't. I love these little these little icons, if you will. Notice that this particular Luke has a circle around his head that would typically be a halo. He's pointing to his third finger on his right hand, and he's got three fingers, his thumb and two fingers sticking out underneath his Bible here. Those are references in Christian art to the Trinity. Oh, my favorite part of this picture is the jewel-studded Bible that he's carrying. That's just lovely. The author of the book of Acts is Luke. Now, the text doesn't anywhere say that it was written by Luke, but all of Christian history, going all the way back to the early church fathers, confirm that Luke is the author of Acts. And Acts exists as part of a two-volume work that sometimes we call Luke Acts. In other words, if you were, and I'll show you some of the evidence of that here in just a moment, but if you read the book of Luke, it opens the same way that the book of Acts does. The book of Luke ends with kind of a hole in the narrative, an incomplete narrative. The book of Acts picks up where that narrative leaves off. And so it looks very much like Luke is writing the book of Acts as part two of a two-volume work that lays out the story of Jesus and then what Jesus continued to do through the apostles. Now, if you were to look at all of the early church fathers, they will all tell you that Luke is the one that they believe wrote the book of Acts. We're not going to get into all of that stuff here, but I will give you one quote as we approach here a little bit later. What do we know about this Luke? I mean, clearly he's got red hair. Yeah. Is he, I don't know, he's sunburned on his face a little bit? I don't know. What do we know about Luke? Well, one of the things we know about Luke when we piece together all the things in the New Testament is that Luke was a student of the apostles. Luke says in the opening to his gospel, he says this in the first two verses. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the very beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Luke admits in his gospel that he is doing investigation, that he wasn't there, but that his sources that he's doing investigation and research from are the eyewitnesses to the ministry and resurrection of Jesus. He says here that he's getting this as it was handed down to him by those who were eyewitnesses from the beginning. I know it says from the first here. That's what he means. From the very beginning, they were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. These are not two separate groups. The eyewitnesses are the apostles, and the apostles are the servants of the word as Jesus has commanded them to be at the end of Luke's gospel, at the end of John, etc., and so on. One of the things that we know about Luke is not just that he was a student of the apostles, is that he was also a traveling companion of Paul. Now, here I want to get into the we statements in the book of Acts, because one of the things that we notice as we read through the book of Acts is that beginning in chapter 16, verse 10, the pronouns all begin to change. So, until chapter 16, verse 9, the narrative reads like this: They went here, there, and yonder. They did this, that, and the other. But starting in verse 10, the pronouns shift from they to we. We went here, there, and yonder. We did this, that, and the other. The implication here is that the author of the book of Acts begins traveling with Paul at that time. Now, this narrative is about Paul. That's why I say Paul. In chapter 16, is the narrative is being told about Paul. And so now all of a sudden the pronouns change from they, like the author is writing about something very, very distant, to we. Like now he has begun traveling with them. These we statements appear in these particular texts, which I'll put up on the screen for you. One of the things that this suggests to us is that in this particular time, Luke becomes a convert of Paul. That in chapter 16, the reason the pronouns shift is that this is when Luke begins traveling with Paul, and we think that Luke is a convert of Paul. He made a convert out of Luke, and Luke takes up with Paul. One of the interesting things about Luke and his ministry is that once he begins traveling with Paul, he will not leave Paul's side until Paul's death. At the very, very end of Second Timothy, the last document that Paul ever wrote, he says, only Luke is with me. And so we know that Luke is a traveling companion of Paul. He was really devoted to Paul and stayed with him right up until the very end. We know that he was with Paul in prison. When I read Colossians chapter 4, Colossians is one of the prison epistles. Paul says that he's in prison. And in that letter, he says, Our dear friend Luke, the doctor, and Demas send you greetings. We know that Paul wrote that from prison, and so Luke winds up he's with Paul in prison, or is at least in the same area. Also in Philemon, another of the prison epistles, he says, Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ Jesus, sends you greetings. And so do Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke, my fellow workers. Notice in Philemon, verse 23, he says that Epaphras is his fellow prisoner. And so it's not really clear when we get to the next sentence, is he saying Epaphras is my prisoner and also here are Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke? Is he saying that, or is he saying Epaphras is a fellow prisoner and these guys also are? I tend to think that what's going on here is that Epaphras is in prison with Paul. He's kind of under house arrest, if you will. Epaphras is a prisoner with him, but Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke, they're all kind of hanging around the area, taking care of Paul, because Rome didn't really take care of you. They put you in a cell and lock the door, and you're dependent upon people from the outside to take care of you. So they might be there taking care of Paul. Paul is in the presence of Luke right up until the very end. I had noted this earlier. Here is the last thing that Paul ever wrote, or that Luke wrote for him. Do your best to come to me quickly. Demas, who we've noted in the previous prison epistles, because he loved the now age, has abandoned me and has gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, and Titus to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Right at the very end, right before Paul's execution, Luke is with him all the way to the very end. So we know that Luke is a traveling companion of Paul. He's a student of the apostles. He hangs around with Paul, listens to Paul preach, goes with him, watches Paul debate, watches Paul do evangelism and make converts. And so Luke is because of his proximity to Paul, is going to be really, really educated, not just in the scriptures, but also in New Testament faith. We also know that Luke was a Gentile. Pick up this text in Galatians chapter 4, again, one of the prison epistles, but notice how Paul frames the greetings that he wants to send here at the end. He says, "My fellow prisoner Aristarchus sends you his greetings, as does Mark, the cousin of Barnabas. You've received instruction about him. If he comes to you, welcome him. Yeshua, who is called Eustace, also sends greetings. These are the only Jews among my co-workers for the kingdom of God, and they approve to comfort to me. Epaphras, who is one of you and a servant of Christ Jesus, sends greetings. He's always wrestling in prayer for you that you may stand firm in all the will of God, mature and fully assured. I vouch for him. He's working hard for you and for those at Laodicea and Hierapolis. Our dear friend Luke, the doctor, and Demas send greetings." Now, notice the way that Paul frames this in Colossians. He says, Aristarchus, Mark, Yeshua, Justitia, these are the only Jews among his co-workers. The implication is that the ones that he lists after that are non-Jews. And the word we use for that is Gentile. And among them, he mentions Epaphras, Demas, and Luke. So the implication here is that Luke is a Gentile, which may explain in Luke's gospel some of the overt focus on the gospel being available to Jew and to Gentile alike. One of the things that almost everybody knows about Luke is that he was a doctor. Now, I put this in question marks because there's some ambiguity about really what this term actually means. In Colossians 4, we read this text earlier. He says, "Our dear friend Luke, the doctor, sends you greetings." Is Luke a physician? I mean, that particular word is used in Luke's gospel to denote specifically those who deal in medical stuff, the word that we call physician. Let me give you a couple of examples here. In Luke 4, verse 23, Jesus, preaching in Nazareth, says, "I know you're going to quote this proverb to me, physician, heal thyself." The word that is used here, physician, is the same word that is used, that is rendered doctor in Colossians chapter 4. Jesus will also say in Luke chapter 5, the healthy don't need a physician or a doctor. Now, here's what I'm trying to really point out to you. Consistently in Luke's vocabulary, this word tends to mean those who deal in medical stuff. Some time ago, there was a movement to really comes out of one particular work that the scholar published, when she's trying to argue that to prove that Luke was a doctor based on all of the medical terminology that appears in the Gospel of Luke. So he climbed through the book of Luke and he's trying to point out, hey, look at all this medical terminology. Look how technical these medical terms are. But when you get down into it, you find that the words that he's drawing on are just simple everyday words. So they put nails in Jesus' hands. They put nails in his feet. If Luke were a physician, I might expect him to render that a little bit differently. If they say they put a crown of thorns on his head, I might expect Luke to say that they put a crown of thorns at the top of his cranium. I might expect him to use all different kinds of medical terms. Clearly, I'm not a physician, so I'm struggling to find the terms here. And so this idea to prove that Luke was a medical doctor simply based on the medical vocabulary didn't really work. If I were reading the last two chapters of the book of Acts and watching Luke describe Paul's seafaring voyage, where Paul is on a boat, there is tons and tons of very technical nautical vocabulary in that travel narrative. If I were applying that same logic that this scholar used all those years ago, I could come away from this saying Luke was a sailor. Now, it might be that Luke was one of the professionally educated. Physicians were among the professionally educated in the first century world. Some physicians were historians. Some of them were orators, what you might call a lawyer or a professional speaker. And so when you think about sort of if I can put it this way, this is not a good way to put it, but it's what I've got right now, to think about the trades and the professional jobs, the trade jobs and the professional jobs. And so you might have in the trade jobs bakers and carpenters and blacksmiths and all kinds of folks who work down at the marketplace. The professionally educated are going to do things like write history. They're going to research, write history. They're going to compose speeches for senators. They might help them deliver them. They might be educators and whatnot. And when you read, I was reading Craig Keener's commentary on Acts, which is very good and very thorough and very detailed. And he notes that the physicians are among this professionally educated class, and that we have certain numbers of physicians who are also noted to be historians. Here's what I'm really getting at. I think that Luke is probably a physician. I think he's probably one of the professionally educated, and that his professional education includes some training in medicine. Maybe as much as Paul got beat nearly everywhere that he went, it might have been good to have a physician around him at all times. And so we use this term doctor, but I'd like for you to start thinking about it in terms of Luke is a highly educated, very professional individual who also has training, or part of his training is in medicine. He's much more competent than just that one particular limited field. We also know that Luke is the author of Luke Acts. We're going to compare the introductions to Luke and Acts later when we get to chapter 1. But for now, just note that these two books go together, as I noted earlier. So we come to the end here and we say, well, the end of our introduction to who was Luke. And we find out that Luke is a Gentile convert to the way of Christ. He's a traveling companion of Paul. He winds up with Paul in Rome. Whether or not Luke is imprisoned is a whole different issue. He's very learned, and that he is the author of Luke and Acts. Now, as I said earlier, the book of Acts never says that Luke is the one who wrote it, but all of the early church fathers believed that Luke Acts is written by this one person. And so here's often where I get into historical evidence and digging up quotes from the early church fathers. They never suggest that anybody else is the author. So when we read things like the pastoral epistles or the book of Revelation, or I'm sorry, if we're reading the early church fathers on these matters, there tends to be some ambiguity. And they'll say, we don't know if it was John the Apostle or the elder John or John of Patmos and whatnot. But with Luke, they don't do that. They never ever suggest anybody else as the author of this 2-volume work. And so I'm not going to go through a long litany of quotes from the fathers for our purposes. One citation will demonstrate that. And I give it to you from Eusebius, Bishop of Caesarea in around 325, 350, who was a church historian. Don't you love him just hanging around in his pajamas there, writing his history? Here's what Bishop Eusebius has to say. Luke, who was of Antiochian parentage, in other words, he's from Antioch, and a physician by profession, was especially close with Paul. That word intimate's an old word, it just means close with him, and well acquainted with the rest of the apostles, has left us in 2 inspired books proofs that the spiritual healing art which he learned from them. One of these books is the Gospel, which he testifies that he wrote as those who were from the beginning eyewitnesses and servants of the word delivered unto him, all of whom, as he says, he followed accurately from the beginning. The other book is the Acts of the Apostles, which he composed not from the accounts of others, but from what he had seen himself. And they say that Paul meant to refer to Luke's gospel wherever, as if speaking of some gospel of his own, he used the words, according to my gospel. That last little bit that is an indication that Luke's gospel is the recorded preaching of Paul, or the gospel that Paul wants to put out there. Noting for us that Luke is the scribe of Paul and putting these documents in print and whatnot. That's a really interesting part. What I would like for you to see here is that Eusebius notes for us Luke wrote 2 things, the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. Which takes us to this question. Why did Luke feel the need to write the book of Acts? Well, the purpose of the book of Acts may be bound up with the date of the book of Acts. We get to the end of the book of Acts, and Paul is imprisoned in Rome. Actually, it's A bit of a misnomer to say he's in prison. He's on house arrest in Rome. Paul had been sent to Rome. Actually, he appealed to Caesar to hear his case. Paul had gone to Jerusalem to observe one of the Jewish feasts. He hadn't been there in a long time, and he's Jewish, and so he wants to go down there and really just kind of connect with his roots. While he's there, there's trouble from the Jewish leadership and from the crowd, just like it was with Jesus. A Roman soldier intervenes and protects Paul. They put him on trial in several scenes over the next several years. Paul is waiting for trial. And when it becomes clear to Paul that they're just holding him in prison, hoping to get a bribe from someone, Paul exercises his right as a Roman citizen to have Caesar hear his case directly. So he exercises his right, he appeals to Caesar, and now they've got to ship him to Rome. Paul goes to Rome, and the way it works with Rome is they hold you until your accusers come to make their case. It's not like in America where you're innocent until proven guilty. Rome doesn't know whether you're innocent or not. So their tendency is you're here for a trial, we're going to hold you up, and we're going to make sure that you don't run away until your accusers come. Well, the accusers don't ever come, at least not in the narrative of the book of Acts. Rome can hold you for 2 years, and at the end of 2 years, if your accusers don't come to make their case, they let you go. If your accusers don't care at the end of 2 years, then neither does Rome. And Luke notes for us at the end of Acts, for 2 whole years, Paul was in house arrest in Rome awaiting his trial. The 2 whole years suggests that Paul was eventually released. If there was a trial, Luke would have recorded that for us. I mean, that's where this whole narrative has been driving. He doesn't record that for us. So the implication is that Paul is there for 2 whole years and then he is released. Luke is probably writing during that time. Paul's under house arrest, he can't really go anywhere, and so Luke is taking the time and using that time judiciously to compose the second of his 2 volumes. Now, if that's the case, then the purpose of Acts may be to be a defense of Paul. Paul is imprisoned for stirring up riots. He is imprisoned and up on charges of political dissidence. And so when you read the book of Acts, you note that everywhere Paul goes, except for Athens, everywhere Paul goes, there are riots. But you also note that everywhere Paul goes and there are riots, he's never the one who starts it. When Paul goes to Lystra and Iconium, it is the Jewish leadership who starts the trouble there, and they follow him from town to town, stirring up trouble everywhere he goes. Paul then goes to Thessalonica in Acts chapter 17, and it is the politarchs, the city officials of Thessalonica, who say, these men who've turned the world upside down have now come here, and there's all kinds of trouble. They can't find Paul, so they beat one of his friends. It's kind of a big mess. When Paul gets to Ephesus, it was a silversmith named Demetrius in that town who started the trouble. There was a riot in the city. They almost killed Paul. And so it's not Paul who starts the riots. In fact, the one case in Acts 17, when Paul goes to Athens, Paul there, excuse me, there, Paul preaches with the preaches in the Areopagus, and at the Areopagus, they're super cool with him. There's no riots that are started there. Some believe, some don't. But at the end of the day, there are no riots. So Paul is imprisoned for stirring up riots. And part of what Luke might be doing is, as he's writing this narrative, constantly putting up Paul as innocent of all of these charges. Paul is not the one starting the riots. It is always someone else who is opposed to the gospel of Jesus who starts these riots. And so if that's the case, Luke may be writing a defense document for the Roman court that they can read ahead of Paul's trial to understand Paul is not guilty of these charges. Okay, then, Dr. Hardin, why then do you have 12 chapters on Peter and the rest of the apostles? If this is all a defense of Paul, then why do we have the stories of those guys? Well, in order to tell the story of Paul, you kind of have to understand this gospel that he has attached himself to. And so that requires, telling the story of Jesus in Luke's gospel, and then telling the story of what happened after that. And then you note how Paul picks up on the journey. It might also be, maybe, that Luke is defending all Christians here, not just Paul, which makes me question this. Is more persecution coming? Maybe Luke is looking at, look at the way they're treating Paul. Look at the way that they've been treating Peter. If someone doesn't instruct the empire in these matters, there will be more persecution coming. And so maybe what Luke is doing is defending Paul, but at the same time defending all Christians along the way. So here's the purpose of the book of Acts, at least one of them, defending Paul's innocence before the Roman court, but also telling the spread of the gospel. Luke said in his gospel that he wanted to write a sequential narrative of the story of Jesus. There's some technical language in that third verse in the Luke 1 that indicates that. And then he also says, I want to give you a sequential narrative from start to finish. Here's what happened so that you might be assured of what you've been taught. You might have confidence in the things that you have been taught. And maybe these two purposes of defending Paul's innocence and then educating you in the story of Jesus and the gospel, maybe these two purposes go hand in hand. If he's going to defend Paul in front of the Romans have to have a sequential narrative understanding of the faith. And so maybe that's what Luke is doing. Well, here are the themes I want you to watch out for as we continue to read through the book of Acts. He says this in Acts 1. In my former book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and teach. The former book that he mentions here is the Gospel of Luke. And so if the Gospel of Luke is what Jesus began to do and teach, then Acts is what Jesus continues to do and teach. There are a lot of similarities between the ministry of Jesus in Luke and the ministry of the apostles in the book of Acts. Now, these are not all of them. This is only maybe about 2% of all the things you'll see in the book of Acts, but let me show you here in this handy-dandy, very professionally made chart that I worked on for about 30 seconds. Okay. What is Jesus doing in his ministry, and what are the apostles doing? For the sake of convenience and to show you the connections, I've chosen all of the gospel accounts from the book of Luke, just to show you what Luke is trying to do. The first thing that Jesus does in his ministry, once his ministry begins, is to choose apostles. And so in Luke 6, he chooses 12. The first thing the apostles do in the book of Acts is to choose an apostle to replace Judas. In Luke chapter 3, the Spirit descends on Jesus. In Acts chapter 2, the Spirit descends upon the apostles. In Luke 5, Jesus heals a lame man. In Acts 3, Peter and John heal a lame man. In Luke 8, Jesus goes to heal a little girl, and when he says, when he goes to meet with her, when he goes to meet with the parents, this girl's dead, and Jesus says to her in Mark's gospel, Talitha kumi, little girl, get up. In Acts chapter 9, Peter is taken to the home of a girl named Tabitha, where Jesus had said Talitha, which means little girl, Talitha kumi. In Aramaic, Peter here is saying Tabitha kumi. Peter knows what to do. And it's not that Peter is doing this for Jesus, it's that Jesus is still working through Peter, doing the things he always did. As he raised a little girl in Luke 8, he's raising a little girl in Acts 9. In Luke 8, there's a story about a woman touching Jesus' garments and being healed. There's some weird stuff going on in Acts 5 and Acts 19 with the garments, with Peter's shadow and with the little handkerchiefs that Paul is carrying around. Very bizarre stuff. In Luke chapter 22, Jesus is arrested in Jerusalem. So are the apostles in Acts 4, Peter and John, and Paul in Acts 22. And the book of Luke ends with Jesus on trial with the Romans. So does Acts 26 put Paul on trial in front of the Romans. And so one of the themes we want to watch out for in the book of Acts is this theme of what Jesus continues to do. It's not that the apostles are doing these things for Jesus. It's that Jesus, now risen, is still working, doing the things that he always had been doing, now doing them through his trusted emissaries who he breathed the Spirit on in John 20, who he laid hands on and gave the Spirit to. Another theme we're going to watch for in the book of Acts is the expansion of the gospel. And the key statement in the book of Acts comes in chapter 1, verse 8. I have given it to you here. I have translated from the original Greek into the King James Kentuckian. But y'all will receive power, the Holy Spirit coming on y'all, and y'all will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. So that is a literal translation of what you see in Acts 1:8. So notice here, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. This is the structural pattern of the book of Acts. The gospel spreads through Jerusalem in the first 7 chapters, then goes through Judea in Acts 8 and 9. The gospel encounters the Samaritans in chapter 8, and then Acts chapters 10 to 28 is a recounting of how the gospel is going to the ends of the earth, which is Jewish coded language for the Gentiles. There is a tight connection in this verse between the power of the Spirit and the witnessing or proclamation of the gospel. And so one of the themes we're going to watch for as we read Acts is the power of the Spirit. And so what I want you to see as we note the power of the Spirit is that the Spirit is always gifting folks to do proclamation. Certainly there are miracles, but those miracles always lead to preaching events. And we're going to have some special conversation about who's doing miracles and why and what right they have to do them. And is the Spirit gifting that to everyone or just to certain individuals in the early church? But for now, note this. As it was in Luke chapters 4, 5, and 6, Jesus' miracles tend to lead to teaching events. So also it is in the book of Acts. The miracles always lead to preaching events as they proclaim Jesus as the source behind their miracles. So we get to the end of our introduction of the book of Acts. We find that Acts is written by Luke, a Gentile companion of Paul, during Paul's Roman imprisonment, which is somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 to 62 AD, probably written to defend Paul, maybe others, and to chronicle the spread of the gospel and describe the power of Spirit-led proclamation and the good works that Jesus continues to do. One final question we want to ask before we close out our introduction is this: why the book of Acts? Why study the book of Acts? What part does Acts actually play in my life and in my faith? Does the study of the ancient church have anything to say about the practices of the modern church? In other words, I was at a Acts seminar not too long ago, and the question was put to me this way: is Acts prescriptive or descriptive? Does it tell us what to do, or is it describing what happened? And that's a complicated question for a movement that I'm a part of that places an emphasis on restoring the earliest church. Well, one of the reasons we study the book of Acts is that it is the record of the earliest church. There are several restoration movements. I belong to a group, a collective of churches that calls itself the Restoration Movement. That's a bit of a misnomer because there are lots of restoration movements out there. In such movements, the goal is always to restore the practices of New Testament Christianity. Why are there so many restoration movements? Well, because a lot of times modern practice strays from that ancient path. And so as we make little adjustments based on our culture, and we're still close to the path, but over time we just make so many adjustments, we're way off the path. And so a lot of times we'll find folks who say, look, we need to like move back to the path and get back to what the earliest church was doing. The reason Acts is important is that it gives us the earliest description of the Christianity that we are trying to restore. So we read it and we study it and we say, hey, maybe the things that they paid attention to are the things that we ought to pay attention to. Second, Acts shows how the apostles practiced the faith. The apostles, I don't know if you've noted how even already I keep using the capital A for them. The apostles, the 12. The 12. Is it 12 plus minus Judas plus Matthias, and then Paul is at 13. I don't know. Their gang name is the 12. I always capitalize them because they're important for the life of the kingdom and the church. They are the ones who learned the faith that Jesus taught them. They practiced the faith that Jesus taught them. They handed down that faith to us. And so their working out of the faith is how Jesus envisioned it. In other words, what we see them doing in the book of Acts is this is how Jesus wants it to go. Now, again, we're going to have some questions about how far we press that pattern. Did Jesus want them to always meet in synagogues? Maybe not necessarily. Did he always want them when they gathered to preach the scriptures? Yes. And so we have to think very carefully about how far we press that pattern. But at the basic core, the book of Acts shows us how the apostles practiced the faith. Acts also gives us a pattern of worship and doctrine. The apostles' example is still a pattern for our worship. What did they think it was important to do during worship? What did they think it was important to teach and to preach? One of the assignments I tend to do in a course like this is to have preaching majors examine the pattern of the apostles' preaching. And they always come away noting what the apostles preached really doesn't look anything like the way the modern church crafts sermons in North America. So those are some things that we're going to have to think about. What were their recurring components of their message? What was the pattern of salvation to them? This becomes a bit of an issue. You get so many folks saying, here's when you ask someone, how does a person become saved? There are several answers to that question. And the only way we really cut through all of that and get to the heart of biblical truth is to simply open up the book of Acts and to say how, when people came to the faith, what happened? What did they do? How did they lead them to Jesus? What the apostles regularly taught and practiced helps us understand what Jesus envisioned. Now, I say regularly taught and practiced because there are always going to be some weird things and we're going to have to deal with them. So let's get to this issue of salvation. Acts is the earliest record of how people were saved. In Acts 2:37, the very first moment that Peter preaches, he's so convicting that the people say, then what must we do to be saved? He convicts them that they murdered the Messiah. God sent the Messiah to Israel and they murdered him, and they're very bothered by that, as one should be. So they ask Peter, well, what do we have to do in order to be saved? That's the question first posed to the apostles. How they answer in that moment is still important for us, I think. And so if somebody asks, hey, how do I get saved? Our response needs to be in concert with how the apostles answered that question. And again, I want to note this, not just one instance. What is their pattern? Late in the book of Acts, Paul says to the Philippian jailer, call upon the name of the Lord and you will be saved. And some folks will read that and say, well, all I got to do is vocalize the name of Jesus. Just call upon the name of the Lord. Acts chapter 2 finds Peter quoting that very text from Joel chapter 2, all who call upon the name of the Lord will be saved. And in that moment, Peter, the instructions he gives, indicates for us what it means to call upon the name of the Lord. And it's more than just vocalizing the name of Jesus. And so when we get to Acts 16 and we find Paul say that, we have to say, okay, this is one instance. I can't just use that one instance and ignore all of the other evidence throughout the book of Acts. We've got to examine the patterns and see all of biblical truth, not just the parts that we like and ignore the parts we don't like. So that's why we study the book of Acts. Which leads us to some questions, which I'm not going to answer here. I just want to put these on the table. How far do we press the pattern of the book of Acts? Lots of folks will say, we just need to get back to the church in Acts 2. Well, how far do we want to press that? Are we all moving to Jerusalem? Are we all going to become Jews, Messianic Jews? Are we all going to learn the Jewish prayers and start attending synagogues? All of us have this idea about restoring the pattern of the book of Acts, but we all have a limit as to how far back we're willing to go. And we want to pick up the things in the book of Acts that are timeless and not dependent or tied to culture. Is Acts still relevant for modern times and modern issues? That's a question we have. Is this how Jesus wanted it to go in the first century? Or is the book of Acts how Jesus wanted it to go for all churches at all times? How much are we to imitate the apostles? I mean, look, let's be honest. These apostles are they're doing miracles, they're wielding influence over other churches. Paul is telling the Galatian churches what they need to do in regard to offering, and he's being really disciplinary with the Corinthian church. I mean, he's not even in town, and he's being disciplinarian with them. So how much are we to imitate the actions of the apostles? Are we to imitate the actions that they practiced? Like, am I supposed to go do miracles and raise the dead and heal the lame? Or am I to practice the same kinds of things that they practiced? The kinds of things they did were the proclamation of Jesus and the meeting with the community and reading the scriptures and explaining them and taking the Lord's Supper and engaging in worship and being good with their communities in order to give Jesus a good name. The miracles are a very small part of what they do. In a time when it's popular to deconstruct one's faith and to question the church, that paradigm brings often a comparison that works like this. If I'm particularly traumatized by a church experience, and that happens to folks sometimes, um, in a deconstruction kind of a mindset, the question is often like the comparison is what the church is versus what I think it should be. In other words, this church treated me bad. I don't think they ought to do that, and they shouldn't. But I don't think that's the way church ought to go. So I'm going to go find a church that fits what I think it should be, or more often than not, it's that's not what I think church is. Therefore, I'm going to abandon church. But friends, there's no life in thinking like that. In such a paradigm, I become the judge of what should and should not be. And I think what we need to do and what the value of the book of Acts is for us is to help us to compare in practice and doctrine what the church is versus the New Testament models. Yeah, sometimes our churches are not good. Sometimes churches are not healthy. Some are, some are not. But in those moments where they're not, it's not good for me to say, well, I don't like the way that they are being unhealthy. Therefore, I'm just going to abandon the faith altogether. What we need to do is to say, okay, that church is not behaving well. I have a paradigm in the book of Acts for what a healthy church looks like. And if I can help that church return to that paradigm, they might find their health again. And so it's those New Testament models that we're looking for, and those models are taught for us in the book of Acts.